Imagine this. You're standing on the Great Plains in the early 1800s. The earth beneath your feet shakes as if thunder is rolling across the land. But when you look up, it's not the sky that rumbles, it's the ground itself. A sea of dark, moving forms stretches from horizon to horizon. Millions of buffalo moving as one, a living tide so vast that it takes days to pass. Now imagine standing in that exact same place, just 70 years later. The sound of thunder is gone. The horizon is no longer alive but silent, littered instead with mountains of bones, skulls, and carcasses left to rot. What happened to one of the greatest animal populations the Earth has ever seen? Was it just the byproduct of expansion and overhunting? Or was there something darker at work, a deliberate policy, a conscious decision to destroy not just a species, but the way of life of the indigenous nations who depended on it? Today, we're going to uncover a story rarely told in full, how the extermination of the buffalo became one of the most devastating and intentional acts of ecological warfare in American history. To truly grasp what was lost, we first have to understand the world as it was before the destruction began. The Great Plains, stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, were defined by the buffalo. Some estimates suggest that there were between 30 and 60 million of these animals roaming the continent. Early European travelers struggled to put the scale into words. Some compared the herds to rivers of life flowing across the land. Others described them as black clouds on the horizon that never seemed to dissipate. The presence of buffalo wasn't just about numbers, it was about balance. The animal shaped the ecosystem of the plains, grazing in patterns that kept grasses healthy, supporting wolves, birds, and countless other species. But the buffalo was far more than an animal to the indigenous nations of the plains. For the Lakota, the buffalo was Tatanka Oyate, the buffalo nation, a sacred relative given by the Creator. For the Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Blackfeet, and dozens more nations, the buffalo was life itself. Its flesh fed the people, its hides became shelter and clothing, its bones and sinew became tools, weapons, and instruments. Beyond the material, it held a spiritual role, honored in ceremonies, songs, and stories. Children grew up hearing that the buffalo had given itself to the people, and in return, the people were bound to respect it. Every hunt was accompanied by ritual, by prayers of thanks. To destroy a buffalo carelessly was not just wasteful, it was sacrilege. This intimate relationship produced cultures that were resilient, mobile, and fiercely independent. With the buffalo as their foundation, plains nations could thrive in environments where European settlers often starved. They could move with the herds, wage long campaigns of resistance, and maintain their sovereignty in ways that baffled American military leaders. For generations, the buffalo was more than food or resource. It was the heartbeat of entire civilizations. To strike at the buffalo, then, was not simply to harm an animal. It was to strike at the very foundation of indigenous life. And that is exactly what would happen. For centuries after first contact, the buffalo herds remained resilient. While fur traders and explorers occasionally hunted them, the sheer size of the population seemed to defy destruction. But by the early 19th century, that began to change. The Industrial Revolution transformed the way Americans thought about resources. Suddenly, everything had to serve the machine of progress, and the buffalo was no exception. By the 1820s and 1830s, buffalo robes, soft hides taken in winter, had become fashionable items in eastern cities and European markets. But the real shift came in the 1870s, when industrial machines in the East required stronger drive belts, and buffalo hides proved perfect for the job. Overnight, the market exploded. A single hide could fetch a good price, and hunters swarmed the plains with new technology, breech-loading rifles that could fire rapidly and kill with deadly efficiency. One hunter with the right gun could slaughter hundreds of buffalo in a week. The arrival of the railroads accelerated the destruction. Rail companies cut straight through the buffalo's range, dividing herds and giving hunters unprecedented access. More than that, the railroads turned the slaughter into a spectacle. Companies advertised hunting excursions, where wealthy passengers could shoot buffalo from the windows of moving trains. Carcasses were left behind to rot, their hides sometimes collected, but often wasted. The efficiency of railroads meant hides could now be shipped east in staggering numbers. Mountains of them piled up at depots, awaiting transport. Even more grotesque was the trade in buffalo bones. Once the hides had been stripped and the meat wasted, bones were gathered by the ton and sold to be ground into fertilizer or used in the production of fine bone china. The land itself became a graveyard feeding distant markets. It might be tempting to see this as mindless exploitation, the inevitable result of capitalism and expansion. But when we look closer, we see that this slaughter was not only tolerated by the government, it was encouraged. The buffalo was more than an animal, it was the foundation of indigenous independence. American officials knew this, and they acted accordingly. By the mid-19th century, U.S. military leaders had grown frustrated with the inability to defeat Plains nations in battle. Campaigns against the Lakota, Comanche, and Cheyenne often dragged on for years, with indigenous warriors proving too skilled, too mobile, and too tied to the land to be permanently subdued. The army might win a battle, but they could never fully break the will of nations who lived off the buffalo. Enter the idea of extermination as policy. General Philip Sheridan, one of the key figures in the Plains Wars, is often remembered for a chilling remark. "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Whether every word of that quote is accurate or not, the sentiment certainly was. Sheridan and others recognized that rifles alone couldn't force the Plains nations onto reservations. Hunger could. By destroying the buffalo, the U.S. could achieve what decades of fighting had failed to do. And so the government looked the other way. While petitions were raised in Congress to protect the buffalo, some even calling for regulations to prevent overhunting, these efforts were dismissed. Lawmakers knew that protecting the buffalo meant preserving indigenous independence. The faster the herds were destroyed, the faster the so-called Indian problem could be solved. Military officers openly encouraged hunters, knowing they were weakening their enemies without firing a shot. Sheridan even praised the hide hunters as allies of the army, claiming they had done more to defeat the Plains nations than soldiers ever could. This was ecological warfare, deliberate destruction of the environment in order to break the people who depended on it. It was conquest not just of land, but of life itself, and its impact would soon become impossible to ignore. Travelers in the 1870s and 1880s described scenes of unimaginable carnage. Buffalo hunters, armed with powerful Sharps rifles, could kill a dozen animals before a herd even realized what was happening. Carcasses were skinned quickly, the hides stacked, and the rest left to rot. The smell of death lingered for miles. One observer wrote of riding across the Kansas prairie and passing carcass after carcass, so many that the land seemed paved with bones. Another recalled that the bones of dead buffalo were so common they became a kind of currency, collected in wagon loads, traded at depots, piled into mountains taller than houses. The sheer waste shocked even some contemporaries. Buffalo tongues were sometimes cut out and sold as delicacies, while the rest of the body was abandoned. Meat that could have fed thousands was left to spoil in the sun. Hunters often shot calves for sport or slaughtered entire herds simply because they could. It wasn't uncommon for trains to slow down so passengers could fire rifles into herds for entertainment, leaving trails of carcasses behind. For indigenous nations, the sight was unbearable. To see relatives, the buffalo, slaughtered in such wasteful numbers was more than grief. It was a spiritual crisis. Elders recalled feeling as though the world itself had been desecrated. One Lakota elder described it as watching the heart of the world stop beating. What had once been a partnership of respect between human and animal had been transformed into a spectacle of destruction. And as the carcasses piled up, hunger spread. The deliberate nature of the policy became undeniable. This was not just greed. It was conquest, carried out through extermination. The Plains nations did not stand idly by. They fought back with courage and determination. The Comanche, who had long dominated the southern plains, resisted fiercely in what became known as the Red River War of 1874. Their goal was not simply to defend their lands, but to preserve their right to hunt buffalo. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho defended their northern ranges, culminating in victories like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer and his men were wiped out. These victories showed the strength and resilience of indigenous nations. But even the greatest warriors could not fight hunger. As the buffalo vanished, the ability to sustain long campaigns disappeared as well. Without buffalo, families starved, warriors weakened, and nations were forced to rely on government rations to survive. Reservation confinement followed, not because the people were defeated in battle, but because their foundation had been ripped away. It's important to recognize this. The extermination of the buffalo wasn't collateral damage. It was the central strategy. By the 1880s, the war for the plains had been won, not on the battlefield, but through starvation. Indigenous sovereignty had been broken by targeting not people directly, but their source of life. By the late 1880s, the destruction was complete. From herds numbering in the tens of millions, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained in all of North America. Travelers who once described the land as alive with movement now saw only emptiness. The silence of the prairies was as profound as the silence of a battlefield after slaughter. And yet survival remained possible. Ironically, it was not government policy, but private individuals and tribes themselves who ensured the buffalo didn't vanish completely. In Texas, rancher Charles Goodnight preserved a small herd on his land. In Yellowstone, a handful of buffalo survived in remote valleys. Naturalists like William Hornaday sounded the alarm, fighting to create preserves. Some native leaders sheltered remnants of herds, determined that the sacred animal would not vanish forever. These scattered survivors became the ancestors of today's buffalo. From less than 1,000 animals, careful breeding programs and restoration projects have brought the numbers back into the hundreds of thousands. But this recovery should not obscure the loss. What exists today is a shadow of what once was. The great herds that moved like living rivers across the plains are gone. The ecosystems they shaped have been forever altered, and the indigenous nations who once lived in partnership with them were forced into transformations they never chose. The extermination of the buffalo was more than an ecological catastrophe. It was cultural genocide, aimed directly at breaking indigenous independence. It reshaped the plains, destroyed a keystone species, and left deep scars on the land and its people. And yet, the story is not one of destruction alone. In recent decades, many indigenous nations have led the way in buffalo restoration, bringing herds back to tribal lands. For the Lakota, the return of buffalo is part of cultural revival, a way of reconnecting with traditions nearly lost. For the Blackfeet, reintroducing buffalo is a way of healing both land and spirit. Each new calf born on these lands is more than an animal. It is a symbol of resilience. But the legacy of the extermination remains. It forces us to ask hard questions about American history. Was this the first great act of ecological warfare on this continent? What does it say about a nation that its expansion depended not just on defeating people, but on erasing the animals and ecosystems those people depended upon? The buffalo's absence speaks as loudly as its presence once did. The silence of the plains after their extermination is a silence that echoes through history, reminding us that conquest was never just about land. It was about life itself. What did you think about today's video? Was the extermination of the buffalo one of the most devastating and deliberate policies in American history? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.